Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Collins for her continued focus on critical infrastructure, because that's something that, in light of what we've learned, I think we need to think through and realize what our exposures are. I want to thank all of our witnesses. Attribution, obviously, of responsibility in cyber attacks is the first key step towards imposing a cost on those involved. Since a number of us wrote to the President in November asking that information on Russian interference in the presidential election be declassified, the four of you in your respective agencies have done some very important work in making as much of your findings public as possible. And I want to say I'm very grateful for that. The public needs to understand what is at risk here. To those who criticize these investigations as partisan, I would remind them that Russia didn't do this to help the Republican candidate. Russia did this to help Russia and to weaken America. And therein lies the heart of why this is so important, because in the next election, the shoe could easily be on the other foot, and a foreign power could decide it wants the Democrat to win this time. I think that both scenarios are deeply offensive, and foreign influence in our elections is intolerable no matter which party benefits in any given election. The ongoing efforts of Russia to impact U.S. elections threatens to undermine faith in our democratic systems, which is precisely their goal, and I think it's critical that they pay a price for their actions. I want to return to the issue of the Russians being able to obtain access to parts of our electoral infrastructure, not the actual machines that count the votes, but the databases. And we've had a couple of questions on this, but I want to ask, first of all, do we know if they would be able to manipulate the kinds of data that they had access to? So, for example, if you have a voter database in a local county that was penetrated, would they be able to change the information within that database?
Potentially, and that was our concern at the time we discovered this. We saw no indication of that, but that's a definite possibility.
If that had happened, and, for example, the FBI or other elements of the intelligence community were not looking for that, would the electoral boards have had indications that that data had changed?
Potentially not. They would have the indication when chaos erupted on Election Day, when someone shows up to vote and your address is different, or your middle initial is different, or some particular is different, that creates delay, controversy, confusion.
So, unfortunately, I think this tells us that we are vulnerable to future attacks and manipulation in this case. And I think that, obviously, you've laid out a scenario that would be very evident, but also we could have very subtle impacts to the elections. You could potentially have a scenario where someone's voter history, for example, is changed. And if they haven't voted for a certain number of years, maybe they get purged from the rolls. Or, you know, many of us have had, we've seen flyers of our colleagues who've been criticized for missing a particular election. Maybe they didn't actually miss that election. So I think it begs the question, what can we do in concert with those local county and city and state entities to make sure that we are protecting this data the way that we should?
Well, part of our charge in this report was carried out jointly by, and I'll ask Director Comey to speak to this, by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, to come up with a set of sort of best practices for inculcating greater degrees of cyber security. The DHS reached out in the run-up to the election to the states, and I think ultimately about every state took advantage of the recommendations proffered by DHS. Jim, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's the answer, is just understanding that they're a target and availing themselves of the expertise and technology to try to protect themselves. And then we, on the intelligence community side, pushing to them indicators of the bad guys.
Director Clapper, I want to, with my last question, sort of change gears here for a moment. I asked you in the Armed Services Committee here in last week about the role of Russian propaganda media outlets like RT. I saw a comment from General Flynn last August that sort of compared RT to CNN or MSNBC. Is that a fair analogy? Is there a structural difference between the way that RT exists within the media infrastructure and, say, a Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or CBS?
To me, the major difference here is the bulk of funding for RT comes from the Russian government, and the Russian government gives editorial direction on what RT is supposed to broadcast. So I think that's a little bit different than CNN.
And they seem to exercise that discretion.
Yes, they do.
Thank you.